You were never meant to hear this, not in school, not in church, not even whispered behind closed doors. Because what happened in the hills of eastern Oregon between 1852 and 1888 wasn't just murder, it was ritual. It was engineered silence, a blueprint of control so dark that even time itself seemed to bury it. But time fails where memory lingers, and tonight, you remember. Imagine a chapel, wooden, rotting, perched above the graves of hundreds. Imagine stepping inside and feeling not peace, but a pressure in your chest. As if the air remembers screams, as if the very walls soaked in blood are holding their breath for someone to finally hear the truth. This is not folklore. This is not fiction. This is the true story of the Grayson family, missionaries of death masquerading as healers. And what they did in the name of God. But behind that cross, they kept records, meticulous, chilling, names, dates, weights, final words. Every blessing they gave was measured, every sermon rehearsed, and every soul they claimed was calculated. Tonight you are not a viewer, you are a witness, not to ghosts, but to a machinery of evil that wore the robe of holiness. They didn't kill for pleasure, they killed for purpose, and that purpose was power. You're going to learn how the Graysons turned grief into currency, faith into a weapon, and vulnerability into a gateway for genocide. You're going to see how American history hides its darkest monsters not in caves or forests, but in churches, with stained glass eyes and sanctified lies. Stay with me. Because once you hear what really happened in Sacred Heart Chapel, you won't look at history or God the same way again. And you'll start to wonder, what if they were just one of many? Let's go back, not in imagination, but into the thick of dust, blood, and quiet disappearances. 52. The Oregon Trail. Over 50,000 people pushing west, chasing dreams, land, freedom, God. But what they found was something else entirely. By the time families reached the Blue Mountains of Oregon, they were broken, physically, emotionally, spiritually. Children already buried in makeshift graves, mothers coughing up blood, fathers limping beside oxen too weak to carry more. And that's when they saw it, perched like a savior in the haze of heat and sorrow. A chapel, Sacred Heart, wooden, modest, cross atop, a preacher standing outside, eyes gray as storm clouds, arms open like he'd been waiting for them. That man was Father Morai Grayson. He didn't speak like a frontier man. He spoke like someone who had studied the inside of your soul. And with him, his wife, gentle, angelic, soft-spoken Sister Constance, and his brother Ezekiel, a quiet worker, always nearby, watching. They didn't offer charity. They offered divine rescue, food, medicine, prayers, and a place to rest. Just for a few days, they said, just until you're stronger. But no one who rested in the Graysons' care ever made it to the other side. The Graysons understood something fundamental. When people suffer, they want two things, relief and meaning. If you give them both, you can do anything to them. So when children began to vomit, when elders grew pale and weak, Sister Constance would explain, "It's the trail sickness, dear. It's God's cleansing fire." And the grieving parents believed her, because what other choice did they have? Meanwhile, Father Morai held funerals in his chapel, beautiful, weeping sermons. He spoke of glory, of salvation, of the Lord's mysterious ways. He looked them in the eyes and made death feel holy. And in the basement, Ezekiel sorted through their belongings, tools, gold, heirlooms, journals, maps. He wrote it all down, like a merchant, like a butcher. The Graysons weren't spontaneous killers. They were architects of affliction. And Sacred Heart wasn't a church. It was a slaughterhouse wrapped in scripture. This wasn't about survival. It was about discovering how easy it was to erase a family when the world already expected them to die. What makes a man righteous? Is it scripture, ritual, the illusion of service? Or is it how many believe his hands are clean, even when they drip in the blood of innocence? The Grayson family understood this distinction better than anyone. They weren't killers in the shadows. They were public saints. To the few settlers nearby, Father Morai was a shepherd. To the local traders, Sister Constance was a midwife, healer, herbalist. To every broken soul staggering toward their chapel, they were hope. But behind that mask was a machinery so cold, so deliberate, it turned murder into ministry. They developed a method. Ezekiel would ride out first, not too far from the trail, just far enough to spot a limping wagon, a broken axle, a desperate family. He'd wait until the moment was right, then appear, friendly, helpful, quiet. "Come rest at the chapel," he'd say. "Father Morai will pray for you. Sister Constance has herbs. We have stew, shelter." It worked every time. Once the family arrived, Sister Constance took over. She'd prepare teas from the Lord's garden, mint, chamomile, lavender, laced with arsenic. She knew the exact dosage. Enough to look like cholera, dysentery, just another tragedy of the westward push. And when the first child died, that's when Father Morai stepped in. He'd dress in white robes, speak Latin, quote scripture from memory. He'd make the burial seem sacred, divine, unquestionable. Parents, sick with grief and too weak to think, surrendered to his voice. They gave him control. By the time the last breath left the final survivor, the Graysons had already begun sorting their things. Ezekiel documented everything: notebooks, names, ages, wealth levels. They didn't just kill, they recorded. This wasn't about survival. It was about domination, control over the body, control over the narrative, control over memory itself. Each family that disappeared didn't just die. They were scrubbed from the earth, replaced with headstones marked only with crosses. No names, no dates, as if they had never existed. And the Graysons, they slept peacefully because their victims died believing it was God's will. Tell me, viewer, when faith becomes a weapon, when trust becomes a noose, what happens to truth? Walk with me into the basement of the Sacred Heart Chapel. No windows, no air, just cold dirt walls sweating with moisture and the stench of rot beneath a veil of lavender oil. This place, below the altar, was not for storage. It was a sanctified slaughter floor. The stairs creaked on purpose. Not from age, from design. So Sister Constance could hear if someone wandered where they shouldn't. But most never did. They were too busy dying upstairs. Here in the dark, the Graysons kept everything the trail forgot, row after row of boxes labeled in the soft handwriting of Ezekiel. Family A, tools, coins, woman's ring. Family B, baby clothes, silver spoon, journal, burned. Family C, watch, letters, coded, father's rifle. He logged everything. He valued everything. Not like a thief, like a historian of human extinction. Each object meant one more name erased without a trace. But it wasn't just possessions down here. Tucked behind a false wall, hidden by crates of grain, was a second room, smaller, colder, with hooks on the walls. Hooks that had no business in a church. Some say it was for preserving meat in the winter. Others know better. Father Morai called this the chamber of reflection. He claimed the dying were brought here to face God in their final moments. But what kind of God lives underground, surrounded by the screams of the forgotten? The truth? This room wasn't for reflection. It was for conversion, a place where the Graysons decided who lived and who died. See, not everyone who entered Sacred Heart died. Some were chosen. Broken men, vagrants, deserters, outlaws, who saw what the Graysons were doing and chose to join them. To these men, Morai offered purpose, a sacred mission, a family. He baptized them in blood, called them the Redeemed, and sent them into the wild with one purpose: recruitment. The chapel was no longer a trap. It was becoming a network, an infection spreading west, wearing the robes of righteousness. So now I ask you, if evil wears a cross, if murder hides behind prayer, who decides what's holy? We are only 3 sections in, and already you see the design. This wasn't madness. This wasn't chaos. This was order, divine in its cruelty. They say evil thrives in silence. But what if the silence is chanted? What if the most horrific rituals are disguised as worship? By 1855, the Graysons no longer killed for gold. They had enough. Enough tools, enough jewelry, enough buried secrets to vanish 10 times over. But they didn't stop, because something had shifted. What began as a scheme became a sacrament. Father Morai began holding midnight vigils beneath the chapel. He called them rites of purification, blessings for the souls of the departed. But there were no Bibles, no psalms, no light, only circles of ash. Symbols scratched into the floor, older than Christianity, older than Oregon, older than the trail itself. They chanted in Latin, but the words weren't biblical. They spoke of the hollowed flame, the door beneath the earth, and the body eternal. These weren't sermons. They were summonings. Constance brewed something different now. Not poison, not exactly. Infusions made from poisonous plants, strange fungi, and blood. Yes, blood. These were given to the initiates, those redeemed men Morai brought into the fold. They'd drink, vomit, shake, collapse, and then they'd rise, changed, silent, empty-eyed, loyal. These weren't converts. They were vessels. One of them, a man named Caleb Whitlock, wrote about what he saw in a letter that was never sent. Found decades later tucked inside a hollow floorboard, he wrote, "There was something in the ground, something alive. We weren't worshiping God, we were feeding it. Every family we buried wasn't just a victim, it was an offering." That's when the chapel stopped burying people in the cemetery. The graves were still dug, still marked, but they were empty. The bodies were taken below. Why? Some claim the Graysons believed in an ancient force beneath Oregon, not a devil, not a demon, but a presence, older than Christ, elder than man, that demanded blood for protection and silence for power. The rituals weren't about salvation, they were about containment. Keep feeding it, or it wakes, and they were loyal. Because by now, they didn't see themselves as murderers. They were priests of something too big, too old, and too dangerous to name. And the trail, that was their altar. He was just 11. His name was Nathaniel Creel, the youngest son of a carpenter from Independence, Missouri. In July of 1856, his family, a father, mother, and 2 older sisters, stopped at the Sacred Heart Chapel after their wagon axle splintered on a descent. The chapel, once again, appeared like a mirage in timber. At first, Nathaniel remembered kindness. Father Morai offered prayer. Sister Constance treated his mother's aching joints with warm salves. Brother Ezekiel carved toys from oak for him and his sisters. They stayed 6 days. On the 7th night, Nathaniel woke to screaming. He crept from the cabin and saw lanterns glowing beneath the chapel floorboards, through a hatch he'd never noticed before. What he saw next never left him. His mother, bound at the wrists. His father's body, pale, still, and drained. And a chant, not loud, not emotional, just rhythmic, like a metronome counting down to something unholy. The Graysons stood in a circle of bones, and in the center, Sister Constance held a knife that glowed red, though no fire touched it. Nathaniel didn't cry. He didn't scream. He ran. He hid beneath an overturned wagon for 3 days, surviving off crackers from a supply box. He watched as his sisters were led, one by one, into the chapel. They never came back out. On the 4th night, a passing caravan found him, covered in dirt, eyes wide, mouth whispering just one word over and over: below, below, below. Nathaniel never saw the chapel again, but he wrote. Pages and pages. Not just memories, maps, diagrams of the chapel basement, symbols he had memorized in one feverish moment, accounts of rituals, of offerings, of the thing beneath. His writings were discovered in 1892 in a Missouri orphanage attic, decades after he died of tuberculosis at 32. Historians dismissed them as delusions. But what if they weren't? What if Nathaniel's drawings, almost identical to Sumerian underworld symbols, weren't imagination, but memory? What if the chapel wasn't just a front for murder, but a gate? Because now something darker becomes clear. The Graysons weren't just profiting from death. They were managing it, curating it, feeding it, and those who escaped, like Nathaniel, were never the same. You won't be either. And the Grayson secret? It wasn't just buried. It was sealed, denied, and burned from the record, with blood still drying on the page. By 1861, whispers had started. Too many families, too many natural deaths clustered around the same stretch of trail. A few survivors, like an emaciated blacksmith from Ohio, claimed to have seen shrouded figures moving beneath the chapel at night. Washington took notice. That fall, 2 U.S. government agents, Jonathan Baird and Elias Dunn, were dispatched under the pretense of mapping safe relief stations along the Oregon Trail. But that wasn't their real mission. They carried sealed orders from the Office of Territorial Affairs to investigate the Sacred Heart Chapel. We know this because of a single telegram sent from Pendleton, Oregon. Arrived 20 miles east, local families report strange disappearances. Chapel under suspicion. Will investigate at dawn. Baird. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. 3 weeks later, a scout named Cooper Ward found their horses wandering loose. No bodies, no gear, just a single burnt Bible left open on a tree stump, pages singed, one verse intact. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be brought to light. Luke 8:17. But nothing was ever brought to light. Instead, Washington quietly closed the investigation. Files were sealed indefinitely, and the Grayson family, they were granted tax exemptions and official recognition as frontier missionaries. Let that sink in. The government knew something and chose to protect it. Why? Because some truths are too destabilizing. If the Graysons were simply killers, justice would have been swift. But they weren't. They were part of something older, something woven into the fabric of expansion, of conquest, of manifest destiny. They were an instrument. The chapel wasn't just a house of death. It was a filter, separating the fearful from the faithful. offering not salvation, but selection. When you look at the photos of Baird and Dunn, strong men, educated, armed, ask yourself, what did they see in that basement that silenced them forever? Because this isn't just about the past. In 1948, inside a forgotten warehouse beneath the Library of Congress Annex, a low-level archivist named Samuel Kessler discovered a box that should not have existed. It was mislabeled, filed under Missionary Activity, Oregon Territories. But inside were 2 blood-stained pages, a warped silver crucifix, and a sealed envelope marked Baird, Dunn, Restricted, Level Black. Kessler was no conspiracy theorist. He was a man of order, of structure, a former army clerk with a limp and a drinking problem. But what he read inside that envelope would sober any man for life. The pages weren't just reports. They were confessions. Written in Baird's handwriting, shakily, feverishly, likely as he lay dying, the words spill like a last gasp from hell. They do not worship Christ. They mimic him, parody him, the rituals, the wine, the hymns, all twisted to open something. I saw bodies drained and arranged beneath the altar, not buried but displayed, as if the dead were listening. Elias was taken. I heard him scream through stone. I begged them to show me, and they did. God forgive me, they did. The chapel is not built on earth, not fully. Beneath it, the floor is older than bone, carved with signs not made by men. Tell no one. Bury this. The country cannot survive it. Samuel Kessler, trembling, stuffed the documents back into the envelope, resealed the box, and placed it at the back of the deepest archive shelf. But not before making one carbon copy. That copy was later passed to his son, who became a professor of American religious history, and in a moment of guilty confession before his death in 1991, gave it to an investigative journalist named Marla Den. Dean's manuscript was immediately blacklisted. No major publisher would touch it. Her interviews vanished. Her academic references were revoked. Her passport flagged. And then she disappeared. Read in 1993. Car never found. Ask yourself, what secret is so powerful, so destabilizing, that it can erase both the truth and the truth-teller? The Graysons weren't just mass murderers. They were high priests of an older liturgy, a perverse order that used Christian symbols not to save souls, but to claim them. And Sacred Heart Chapel? It wasn't a church. It was a gate. They thought it was just a basement, a place for supplies, a place for the dead. But beneath the Sacred Heart Chapel, below the soft dirt and hand-hewn planks, was stone, not the kind found in Oregon's hills, but cut, aligned, and inscribed with symbols no settler, priest, or native tribe had ever claimed. And at its center, a slab, 8 feet long, 4 feet wide, etched with a spiral that bled when touched. What the Graysons built their chapel over wasn't an accident. They chose that ground because it was already chosen. An ancient site that long predates American migration, Christianity, or even indigenous presence. A power well, a convergence, a wound in the earth still open. The slab, locals would later whisper, was a hearing stone, an object meant to receive sound, not send it, but not sound like we know it, not words, not hymns, vibrations, frequencies, sacrifices. It wasn't until 1872 that a drifter named Ellis Rourke, a former military engineer suffering from hallucinations, claimed in a tavern confession that he had helped the Graysons reinforce the basement walls using something called sound-dampening iron mesh, technology far beyond what a frontier chapel should have had. He said it was to keep the singing inside. But no one ever heard singing. only a low hum at night, like bees or bones vibrating. And that slab, Ellis said it whispered, only after the fifth body was laid upon it, only when the ritual was done, only when the house of God had been transformed into a mouth of darkness. But here's the detail that changed everything. The spiral was not etched into the stone. It was growing. Each year, new ridges appeared, not from carving, but from some kind of calcification, like a scar healing over a wound. Except it wasn't healing, it was counting. Every life taken, every prayer twisted, every drop of poison poured in the name of faith. It added another line. By 1888, the spiral had reached the edge of the slab. That's when it began pulling in. The Graysons knew, and they didn't stop. July 9th, 1888, a thunderstorm tore across the eastern Oregon hills like something alive, not just wind and lightning, but rage. And inside the Sacred Heart Chapel, the spiral on the stone slab began to sink. It didn't crack. It didn't collapse. It receded, like something inside was pulling it inward, folding space into itself. Witnesses, if they can be believed, claimed the sky above the chapel turned a dull red, even though no fire burned. Trees along the hillside wilted overnight. Livestock refused to go near the trail for days. But here's what was confirmed. 3 bodies, long buried in unmarked graves behind the chapel, were found unearthed the next morning, not by animals, not by weather, by force. The coffins weren't broken, they were opened from within, and inside, what they found wasn't decay, it was preservation. Mouths wide, eyes shriveled, skin pale and cold, but no rot. It was as if time had stopped the moment they died, as if something had kept them from finishing the journey to the other side. The townspeople called it a sign, but the Graysons called it a mistake. Whatever pact they had struck with that power beneath the slab, whether ancient spirit, parasitic intelligence, or something older than language, it was failing. Or worse, it was changing its terms. That's when Father Morai stopped giving sermons. He spoke only in Latin, even to children. He slept in the basement. He removed the cross from the altar and replaced it with a spiral of twisted metal, forged from the rings of old wagon wheels left by the dead. And Sister Constance? She began fasting, not for holiness, but for obedience. Her journals, found later by federal investigators, were filled with drawings of opened mouths, dozens, hundreds, some human, some not, and every one of them pointed to a single phrase: the soil remembers what the living forget. This was no longer about murder, it was worship, a kind of faith that didn't save, but fed. By late summer of 1888, something had changed in the chapel, not just the Graysons, but the building itself. Travelers described hearing whispers through the walls, even before stepping inside. One man, a scout from a wagon company, said he heard his mother's voice calling his name. His mother had died in Kansas 5 years prior. The Sacred Heart Chapel had become more than a sanctuary. It had become a conduit. Visitors, the few who still dared to stop, would later report feeling dizzy, disoriented, even hallucinating after entering. They described seeing shadows that didn't match bodies, and a staircase that spiraled downward, far deeper than the chapel's original plans allowed. The Graysons told them it was exhaustion, trail sickness, heat stroke, but behind closed doors they celebrated these signs. The spiral wasn't a symbol anymore, it was a gate, and it was opening. Father Morai, now speaking in fragmented, guttural phrases, no longer English nor Latin, began performing what he called the reversals. Rituals meant not to sanctify, but to undo. He inverted prayers. He baptized the dead. He preached sermons at empty pews, calling each soul by name, names that matched the gravestones behind the chapel. And at night, something new began. Lights, not lanterns, but cold, flickering glows, appeared in the woods behind the church. Locals said they looked like stars fallen to earth. Others said they were eyes. Witnesses claim that during one of these rituals, Father Morai slit his own palm and drew a spiral on the chapel floor in blood. The wood beneath bubbled. The scent of sulfur filled the air. And then came the chanting, not from the Graysons, but from the basement. Voices, hundreds, male and female, all in unison, all repeating one phrase: "We remember, we remain, we rise." The Graysons, once cold-blooded opportunists, had crossed the line. They were no longer using evil. They were serving it. In these final days, they opened their doors not just to the sick or weak, but to anyone. Healthy families, young children, soldiers. They needed witnesses, not for sacrifice, but for infection. August 13th, 1888. The final night, the Sacred Heart Chapel welcomed strangers. A thunderstorm rolled in from the Blue Mountains, cloaking the hills in violent darkness. The air crackled with something deeper than electricity, a pressure in the lungs, in the spine. People said even the animals refused to come near. Birds vanished. Dogs howled and hid beneath wagons. Cattle broke loose and stampeded east. And yet, 3 wagons arrived at the chapel's gates. Inside one of them was a 10-year-old boy named Samuel Cole, deaf, mute, and sensitive in ways the world didn't understand. The kind of child people whisper about, calling them touched or marked. Samuel couldn't hear the thunder, but he felt it. He felt something else, too, something older than the storm. That night, the Graysons were not themselves. They didn't greet the travelers with scripture or kindness. They wore ceremonial robes, stitched in geometric patterns, not crosses. They didn't say prayers. They sang in tones that hurt to hear. One witness would later describe it as the sound of bones learning how to sing. The travelers, 6 adults, 4 children, were ushered inside and separated. Some were taken to the basement. Others never made it that far. Samuel, unnoticed and forgotten, crawled beneath a pew. In silence, he watched it unfold. He saw Father Morai walk to the altar with a knife carved from obsidian and bone. He saw Sister Constance dragging something up the stairs, a large burlap sack, leaking blood and teeth. He saw Brother Ezekiel drawing circles around the bodies lying motionless on the floor, and he saw the spiral open. It wasn't metaphor. It wasn't madness. It was a rift, a mouth, a will. It devoured the air, the light, the sound. It drank names. And in that moment, something entered. Samuel didn't run. He couldn't scream. But he watched, and the spiral watched back. Hours later, a passing wagon train saw the chapel engulfed in light. Not fire, not smoke, just light, blinding, white gold, and completely silent. When they arrived, they found nothing. No blood, no bodies, no building, just an imprint in the earth scorched into spiral grooves, and a child standing barefoot, covered in ash, eyes wide with knowledge he would never speak. Samuel Cole would never talk again, but he would draw, and the drawings he made over the next 50 years would appear again and again, in places where evil had taken root. What the U.S. government did next was no accident. Within days of Samuel Cole's discovery, men in unmarked uniforms arrived in the Blue Mountains. Not soldiers, not marshals, something in between. They didn't ask questions. They confiscated everything. The boy, the land, the drawings. Witnesses from the nearby trading post described strange wagons with reinforced iron doors. Some claimed to see crates marked with alchemical symbols, not English letters. Others said the men carried devices that clicked, whirred, and hummed, like compasses made for tracking things that shouldn't exist. The official record says nothing, no arrests, no missing persons. The Grayson land was listed as abandoned and unfit for settlement. But we know better, because Samuel's drawings resurfaced, not in museums, not in books, but in top-secret defense files. In 1947, a declassified military memo labeled Spiral Protocol described a psychological contagion spreading in isolated communities, hallucinations, religious mania, family annihilation. In every case, the events followed the appearance of spiral-shaped diagrams nearly identical to Samuel's art. Some even matched his brushstroke pattern decades later. But here's what they buried even deeper. In a locked vault beneath the Library of Congress, cataloged only as Folio A13, Human Conscience Interruption Experiments, there exists a transcript. It's the interrogation of a man found naked in Death Valley, drawing spirals in the sand with his own blood. When asked who he was, he said, "I am Ezekiel." The loop never ended. The agent dismissed him as psychotic until the man recited, word for word, a sermon delivered by Father Morai in 1856, a sermon never published, never recorded, only whispered to dying families. That same year, 3 intelligence analysts went missing after reviewing Samuel's full sketchbook. The project was shelved, redacted, buried beneath new wars, new threats, new distractions. But some say the spiral never died, it just changed form. Now, it moves through symbols, stories, and systems. Have you seen it? In church architecture, corporate logos, mass rituals masquerading as entertainment? Are you watching the pattern, or is the pattern watching you? Before we go deeper, I need your help to break the loop. Comment, "The spiral ends with me," twice below. Once for your old self, once for the one who's awakening now. Do it. Now. Because the next chapter will show you how the Grayson cult didn't vanish. It moved into medicine. And what they did to soldiers in 1918 was worse than murder. The world was bleeding. Across the Atlantic, millions of young men lay dying in trenches, limbs rotting, minds unraveling, souls hollowed out by a war no one truly understood. But in a remote military hospital in Camp Merritt, New Jersey, something far more disturbing was unfolding. They called it Ward 7. No press, no visitors, no questions. Officially, it was a facility for shell shock recovery, what we now call PTSD. But the men inside weren't being treated. They were being tested. Handwritten logs recovered from a whistleblower doctor reveal an operation codenamed Project Exaltation. It was funded through black budget channels and connected, without explanation, to a private foundation called the Grayson Trust. Yes, that Grayson. The foundation's insignia, a spiral surrounded by Latin words translating to, by suffering, salvation. Doctors, if you can call them that, were instructed to expose soldiers to audio sermons recorded on wax cylinders discovered in eastern Oregon. The sermons were identical to those delivered by Father Morai 60 years earlier. The result? Within 72 hours, the men stopped speaking English. They began murmuring in a dead dialect, Proto-Euphratean, a language lost for over 4,000 years. One patient, Corporal David Bales, carved an entire blood spiral across the padded walls of his cell using a spoon. When he was restrained, he bit off his own tongue and died smiling. His final word? Constance. Another, Private Leo Anders, began reciting the full genealogical line of the Grayson family, details that hadn't been publicly available. He named descendants, dates, causes of death, and then he prophesied 3 more deaths. All came true within a week. A nurse assigned to the ward later confessed to a chaplain that she'd begun seeing faces in the spiral tiles on the hospital floor. She was found 2 days later, drowned in holy water, with spiral etchings under her eyelids, burned in with a heated crucifix. What was this really about? Not medicine, not healing, control. The Grayson legacy had shifted from spiritual manipulation to neurological engineering. They'd learned that the pattern of the spiral, combined with frequency-specific sound and targeted trauma, could override human identity. Not just break a man, rebuild him into something else. And if they could do that to a soldier, what could they do to a nation? This isn't mythology. These are documents, witnesses, and cover-ups you were never meant to see. The year is 1965. America is watching television, religiously. But behind the glowing screens of post-war prosperity, a quieter revolution has begun, one that would never need bullets or ballots, only frequencies, patterns, and trust. It started with a children's program. A little-known syndicated show called The Light Beyond the Door aired briefly in northeastern states, mostly during off-peak hours. Marketed as a morality series, it featured puppets delivering spiritual lessons inside a set made to look like an old chapel, spirals carved into the walls, a faint hymn looping beneath every scene. The sponsor, the Grayson Trust Foundation. At first, no one noticed anything unusual, but within weeks, school counselors in rural Maine and Connecticut began reporting strange behavioral changes in children. Anxiety, obsessive drawing of spiral symbols, speaking in strange tongues. One child was hospitalized after attempting to baptize his baby sister in the sink, submerging her for 5 full minutes. What these children all had in common, they watched the show religiously, and they all spoke of someone named Father Morai. Local pastors grew alarmed. One minister in Augusta, Maine, began publicly preaching that a demonic transmission had infiltrated the airwaves. He even played slowed-down audio of the show's background music during a Sunday sermon. What they heard was not music. It was a sermon, in reverse Latin, a corrupted liturgy that mirrored the final rites used by frontier missionaries in 1850s Oregon. The pastor's name? Caleb Dunwell. He was found dead the following week, hanging upside down from the bell tower of his church, his mouth sewn shut with fishing wire. The FBI got involved, but the file was sealed. Labeled religious sensitivity, compartmentalized casework. The show vanished. All episodes erased, tapes confiscated, sponsors dissolved. But one TOs. Ape survived. It resurfaced decades later in the attic of a retired technician from WTHR-TV in New Hampshire. What was on it? A direct address from a puppet priest to the camera. We are the flame. The spiral opens the door. Say it twice to enter, once to forget. Bend the knee, and you'll rise above all flesh. This was no innocent show. This was a liturgical weapon, targeting the minds of children before they'd even developed critical defenses. The Church of the Spiral Flame had adapted. They no longer needed chapels or sermons. They had screens, frequencies, and a nation begging to be comforted. Now's the time to mark yourself. If you're still here, still listening, comment below. The spiral opens the door. Say it twice. Let the system know you're no longer asleep. The year is 1953. The Cold War is heating up and paranoia is currency. The CIA launches a program so secret, so far-reaching, that even presidents would be kept in the dark. They call it MK Ultra. But what they tell you about LSD trials, mind control experiments on college kids and unwitting civilians is only the first layer. The true origins trace back to Sacred Heart Chapel, 1852. When agents began investigating strange correlations between spiritual ecstasy, obedience, and trauma-based conditioning, they stumbled across a forgotten missionary diary, written by Father Morai Grayson himself. It spoke of a spiral doctrine, a psychological catechism for the soul, a way to break a person and rebuild them in the image of obedience, not through torture, not through threats, but through sacred confusion. The diary was buried in a Catholic archive in Quebec under lock and papal seal, but a covert team, known only as Project Communion, recovered it. What they found: a 3-phase ritual process. Isolation, disrupt familial and social bonds. Confession, induce guilt, fear, and shame until the subject seeks absolution. Recommunion, provide salvation through controlled doctrine. Sound familiar? It became the blueprint for early MK Ultra programming. Except they didn't use prayers. They used chemicals, symbols, repetition, and sound. In one experiment, test subjects exposed to certain spiral patterns while on LSD would later respond to key phrases, even weeks after forgetting the session itself. Another group was told they'd seen visions of angels. In truth, they'd been shown looping footage of a puppet priest whispering subliminals under strobe light. The code word for these spiral-induced sessions? Liturgy Echo. And it wasn't just rogue agents doing this. The funding came from religious universities, Catholic hospitals, and even a Jesuit-affiliated think tank. Father Morai's doctrine had survived and evolved, because the point was never just control, it was rebirth. To take a man and unravel him until he begged for meaning, and then give him one, chosen by the elite. That's what the Graysons knew, that a doctrine wrapped in love, ritual, and divine promise was the perfect cage. And MK Ultra didn't kill that idea, it perfected it. Still think this is just history? Look around. The spirals are everywhere. Corporate logos, kids' shows, video loading animations. They're not branding, they're liturgical symbols, and they're calling you to kneel. By 1961, Project Communion had evolved beyond laboratories and hidden bunkers. It had taken root in culture itself, quietly shaping belief systems, ideologies, and even the tools of healing. The Church of the Spiral Flame, once a coded nickname whispered in MK Ultra documents, became something far more insidious, not an actual church, but a philosophy, a template, rebirth through destruction, cloaked in salvation. They embedded it in therapeutic models, where regression, catharsis, and emotional breakdown were praised as healing. But behind the scenes, the spiral doctrine was running. Isolate the subject, erase identity, reprogram with a higher belief. They called it cognitive realignment therapy, and you can still find traces of it in modern self-help programs, group rehab facilities, and even tech leadership seminars. But it wasn't just psychology, it was religion, reshaped. In 1964, a wave of charismatic churches began spreading across America. Their leaders? Many unknowingly trained in institutes tied to Project Monarch, a successor to MK Ultra. Sermons filled with rhythmic music, hypnotic repetition, emotional confession, and divine revelation bore an uncanny resemblance to Morai Grayson's original liturgies. Worship became entrainment. Faith became submission. By the 1970s, the doctrine had infected Silicon Valley. A select group of early technologists, many with military contracts, began designing user interfaces modeled on spiral theory. Algorithms were built to track breakpoints in human attention. Scrolling became a ritual. Notifications became modern-day confessions. Platforms weren't designed to inform you, but to rewire you. just like the Graysons rewired their victims, one subtle ritual at a time. They called it digital liturgy, and you're living inside it now. Ever notice how social media mimics church? You confess, status update. You repent, hit delete it. You seek validation, likes. And when you go viral, you're reborn. This isn't accidental. This is the Grayson doctrine, perfected by machines. And the final spiral, it's coming. That's why you're still here, because something inside you knows. You've felt the patterns. You've seen the symbols. This story isn't about the past. It's a warning in real time. If you're still watching, comment below. I see the spiral. Twice. Once for awakening, once for defiance. You've come this far. That means something. It means you've already begun to unbind the spiral. But this final truth is the one that never gets spoken aloud. Because it's not history. It's not myth. It's now. You see, the Grayson name died on paper in 1904 when the last known descendant, Elias Grayson, was reportedly killed in a fire in Providence, Rhode Island. A tragic end, they said. A cursed bloodline extinguished, but no body was ever found, no grave, no trace. What the records didn't reveal was that Elias had been recruited. By whom? By a congregation of silence, a network of elite thinkers, intelligence officials, behavioral scientists, and spiritual radicals who saw in the Grayson legacy not horror, but opportunity. They didn't fear what Morai Grayson had built. They wanted to industrialize it. In 1906, a facility was established beneath a psychiatric hospital in rural Vermont. Its purpose? Inheritance through influence. They brought in Elias. They documented every ritual, every sermon, every dosage, and then they digitized the doctrine, decades before the internet ever existed. They called it Project Echo Sermon. By the 1920s, its tenets were inserted into university curricula under the guise of behavioral psychology. By the 1940s, they were encoded into propaganda techniques and mass media testing, and by the 2000s, they were everywhere. Every time you swipe, click, binge, spiral into algorithmic despair, that's the sermon. Every time your screen asks you to confess, to break down, to self-optimize, that's the gospel. The Graysons didn't die. They evolved. You can still see their fingerprints in the motivational cults hiding behind entrepreneurship, in tech CEOs who speak like preachers and treat disruption as divine fire, in educational systems that teach obedience over awareness, in pharmaceuticals that numb the pain but never ask where it came from. And the worst part? You were never meant to question it, but you just did. And that means one thing: you're outside the spiral now. You've crossed into forbidden terrain, where truth burns hot and illusions melt like wax in the sun. You can't unsee it. You can't go back. But you can choose what comes next. Because knowledge like this isn't passive. It demands a reaction. So ask yourself, will you be a vessel for another sermon, or the silence that ends it? If this spoke to something primal in you, share it. Let them know the spiral didn't claim you. Not this time. The macabre history of the Grayson family isn't over. It just left the chapel and entered your hands.